Your life as every level of a detective. Level 1. The patrol years. Level 1 starts nowhere near detective's desk. You spend 6 months at the academy learning defensive tactics, firearms qualification, and the exact legal difference between reasonable suspicion and probable cause, the distinction that decides whether an arrest holds up or gets thrown out before trial. You graduate mid-pack and get assigned to night patrol in a district you didn't request, no seniority to lean on yet. Patrol teaches you things the academy couldn't. The tone of voice that de-escalates a drunk man twice your size. The way a domestic call can turn lethal in 4 seconds. You catch your first real case in year 2, not as the detective, just the first officer on scene at a robbery, learning how much of this job is simply securing a scene and not touching anything until forensics arrives. The tired detective who catches the case asks 4 sharp follow-up questions you don't have good answers for because you were watching the wrong things. You spend the next 3 years building a reputation through paperwork nobody wants to do carefully, reports thorough enough to survive a trial months later. You watch 2 colleagues get passed over for detective promotion despite good instincts because their reports were sloppy, and you understand this job rewards a specific, unglamorous discipline television never shows. The promotion process is its own filter. A written exam on investigative procedure, then an oral board where senior detectives grill you on hypothetical scenarios, watching how you justify your decisions under cross-examination. You pass, but the list is long and slots are rare. You wait 14 months before an opening finally appears in burglary and property crimes. Not the assignment you dreamed about, but the door that actually opened. Somewhere in year 3, you respond to a call that stays with you longer than the dramatic ones. An elderly man found dead 3 weeks after anyone noticed he was missing. You stand in that apartment for 40 minutes, looking at unopened mail on the kitchen table, understanding that a real portion of this job isn't about catching anyone. It's about being the person who shows up after a life quietly ended and nobody noticed in time. You also watch what the job costs people who don't manage it deliberately. 2 officers from your academy class are already divorced by year 4. You start running every morning before your shift, not for fitness, but because you've noticed the job finds its way into your body eventually, and you'd rather it be running than something you can't undo. Your captain pulls you aside before the detective slot opens and tells you your reports are the reason you're on the short list, not your arrest numbers. A compliment that doesn't sound like one, since arrest numbers get people promoted and then fired 18 months later when a defense attorney finds the hole in the paperwork. You remember that sentence longer than almost anything else from patrol. By the end of Level 1, you spent 5 years learning that police work is mostly waiting, watching, and writing things down accurately. You take your detective shield the same week your patrol partner, 5 years senior, gets passed over for the 3rd time, and you don't yet know how much that asymmetry is going to define the rest of this career. Level 2, the rookie detective. Level 2 puts you in burglary and property crimes, and the first thing you learn is how different this is from what you imagined. You're handed 31 open cases your first Monday. No ramp up, just a stack of files and a desk with the previous detective's coffee rings still on it. The national clearance rate for burglary sits under 14%, meaning most of your cases will never end in an arrest. Not because you're bad at this, but because burglars rarely leave anything usable behind. You learn to canvass properly, knocking on 20 doors to find the one doorbell camera that caught a partial angle of a vehicle 3 houses down. You learn to check pawn shop databases daily, because sometimes the fastest way to solve a burglary is finding a stolen ring on a shelf 12 blocks away with a matching serial number. Interviews become your real skill here. Not interrogations yet, just the patient technique of walking a scared homeowner backward through their own morning until a forgotten detail surfaces. You develop a reputation within 18 months for closing cases other detectives let go cold through a patience most detectives don't have time for. You catch your first case involving real violence this level, a home invasion where the homeowner was struck and it gets kicked to a joint investigation with violent crimes. You meet Reyes, an 18-year veteran, and ask him how he does it. He tells you property crimes detectives solve puzzles and violent crimes detectives solve grief, and that the second one costs you something the first one never will. You learn the bureaucracy behind every piece of evidence you touch, chain of custody paperwork that has to be flawless, warrant affidavits that get kicked back twice in your first year for language a more experienced detective would have caught. You rewrite both at midnight, learning that being right about a suspect means nothing if the paperwork can't survive scrutiny. You start testifying in court this level too, small property crime trials where a defense attorney tries to make your careful work sound sloppy in front of a jury. Your reports hold up exactly the way they were built to, and you understand, sitting in that witness box, why the discipline mattered more than anyone explained at the time. Reyes takes you along on a violent crimes call-out near the end of this level, and you watch him interview a witness with a patience that makes your own techniques look rushed by comparison. You leave that night with an ambition you hadn't named out loud yet. Property crimes was never going to be where you stayed. By the end of Level 2, you've closed roughly 1 in 5 assigned cases, a clearance rate your supervisor calls genuinely strong, and you've learned that most of what television shows about detective work happens in maybe 1 case out of 30, while the rest gets solved, if they get solved, through the unglamorous accumulation of pawn shop records and a homeowner finally remembering the detail that mattered. Level 3. The Homicide Detective. Level 3 is the transfer you'd been hoping for since Reyes let you tag along, a seat in homicide within 18 months. Your first case arrives at 3 a.m., a call that wakes you the way no burglary case ever did, and you arrive at a scene taped off with the yellow tape you've walked past 100 times on other people's cases. This time, it's yours, and a body is still under a sheet when you duck under the line. The medical examiner's team works the body methodically for nearly 2 hours before it's even moved, and you stand there taking your own notes, forcing yourself to look at things you'd rather not, because looking carefully at the worst thing in the room is the entire point of you being there. You learn the real numbers behind homicide clearance in your first year, a national rate hovering around 50 to 58%, meaning close to half the murders in this country never result in an arrest. That statistic felt abstract than a training manual and feels entirely different once you're carrying 3 open cases past their first anniversary. Interrogation becomes your real education here, and it looks nothing like television. No raised voices, just hours of patient conversation, because confessions that hold up in court come from patience, not intimidation. You learn the exact moment a suspect's request for a lawyer legally ends your conversation, whether you're 40 seconds from a breakthrough or not, and you learn to live with walking away from that 40 seconds more than once. Your first solved homicide takes 4 months, built from cell tower data, a partial print, and a witness who finally comes forward. The actual confession is quieter than you expected, less a breakdown than a tired man putting down something heavy. And you drive home feeling less triumphant than you assumed, mostly relieved a family finally has an answer. You also catch your first case that doesn't close. A young woman found in a park, no witnesses, no usable forensics. You work it hard for 6 months before it goes into the drawer every homicide unit keeps, not forgotten, just waiting for a break that may never come. Your marriage takes its first real hit this level. Not dramatically, just the slow accumulation of missed dinners and a phone that rings at 3 a.m. often enough that your spouse stops asking what the call was about. At department gatherings, you notice how many senior homicide detectives are on a second or third marriage, and the number stops feeling like coincidence. Reyes retires near the end of this level, 22 years in, and at his send-off he tells you, quieter than usual, that the job never gets easier, you just get better at carrying more weight without anyone noticing. You don't fully understand what he means until years later, standing in his exact position. By the end of Level 3, you've worked 11 homicides, closed 6, and you carry the other 5 the way Reyes described, not as puzzles anymore, but as a specific, ongoing grief you've agreed to hold on behalf of people who can no longer hold it themselves. Level 4. The Cold Case and Major Crimes Detective. Level 4 is a decade and a half in, and your reputation for patience gets you pulled on to the Cold Case unit, a small team working files stretching back 30 years, cases the original investigators worked until they retired or ran out of leads before DNA technology existed to reopen them. Your first cold case file is 19 years old, evidence processed with technology 2 generations behind your department's current lab. You learn the slow bureaucracy of resubmitting old evidence, waiting 4 to 6 months for results because your lab's backlog stretches into the thousands. When the DNA finally comes back with a CODIS match against a man already incarcerated 3 states away, you feel something unexpected. Not triumph, more a delayed exhale on behalf of a family who stopped expecting a call 19 years ago. You start working genetic genealogy cases too, a technique barely a decade old, tracing a suspect through a third cousin's public ancestry profile, solving cases that would have stayed cold under the old methods while raising privacy questions the technology outpaced before anyone finished having the conversation. Court testimony gets harder here, not easier, because defense attorneys in major cases hire their own forensic experts to challenge every link in your evidentiary chain. You spend entire weekends before major trials rehearsing testimony with the prosecutor, after watching a case unravel early this level when you weren't ready for a specific technical challenge. You solve a case that makes regional news, a 19-year-old disappearance explained through forensic genetic genealogy and a suspect who never once appeared on any original detective's radar. Reporters call for a week wanting the dramatic version of a story that actually took 4 months of patient database work and 1 overworked lab tech who prioritized your submission over 11 others. You start mentoring a younger detective this level, recognizing in her the exact patience Reyes once recognized in you. You catch yourself repeating Reyes's exact words to her one night about carrying weight without complaining about it, and understand you've become the version of the job you once only watched from a distance. Your marriage doesn't survive this level, an ending that arrives without much drama, just 2 people who ran out of overlapping time to actually be present in. You move into a smaller apartment near the station and find, uncomfortably, that the shorter commute is the thing you notice most. By the end of level 4, you're carrying a caseload spanning decades instead of months, working alongside forensic scientists more than street informants now, having solved 7 cold cases in 5 years that entirely competent detectives simply didn't have the technology to close decades earlier, a fact that teaches you something uncomfortable about how much of this job's outcome depends on which decade you happen to be working it in. Level 5, the veteran detective. 28 years in, and you're now the person new detectives get sent to shadow, the role Reyes once occupied. You've worked over 200 homicide and major crimes cases, closed roughly 60%, a number slightly above the national average that you've stopped being proud or ashamed of, understanding now what it actually represents, a career-long negotiation with an unsolvable math problem rather than a referendum on your skill. You catch this level, the case that's haunted your department longer than you've been a detective, a 26-year-old disappearance that 4 lead detectives failed to close before retiring. So old, the original lead is now in his 80s and still calls twice a year asking if anything's changed. You reopen it after a young analyst runs old trace evidence through a genetic genealogy database that didn't exist for the first 20 years this file sat in a box, and gets a partial family match nobody else ever had the tools to find. The case takes 14 months to close, building from that single thread to a confirmed suspect, now 61, living quietly 3 states away under his own name, having apparently believed enough time had passed that no one was still looking. You make the arrest yourself, 28 years and 200 cases into a career that started with 31 open burglaries on a desk with someone else's coffee ring, and the moment doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like closing a door that's been open so long you'd started to think of the draft as normal. You call the original retired detective yourself and tell him it's closed. There's a long silence before he says, "Thank you," in a voice that breaks slightly in the middle of the word, and you understand exactly what Reyes meant about carrying weight on behalf of people who can no longer carry it themselves, including, apparently, other detectives. You train your eventual successor seriously in your final 2 years, the same detective you mentored in the cold case unit, now senior enough to run her own major cases. You catch yourself saying things you specifically remember Reyes saying, the exact cadence, an inheritance you didn't consciously choose but that arrived anyway, the way this job moves itself forward, one exhausted sentence at a time. By the end of level 5, you retire with a closure rate you're at peace with. You hand your successor a single file from your desk drawer instead of the property room, the young woman from the park all those decades ago, still unsolved, telling her exactly what Reyes never quite told you outright, that some cases aren't yours to close, only yours to carry as far as you can before handing them to someone with more years left to keep looking. These are the 5 levels of becoming a detective: patrol, puzzles and grief, cold cases solved decades late, and a legacy passed down one exhausted sentence at a time. If you ever meet a detective, understand that the calm way they ask you questions was built from decades of exactly this.